It's a theological world after all, after all, after all, after all.
Why are billionaires suddenly obsessed, or at least interested with consciousness? There's been a renewed fascination with consciousness, and it's not an accident. It's a sign that our culture is rediscovering something, rediscovering questions that materialism never actually answered. Our culture, our society in the West has been dominated in large form by cultural materialism and rooted in biological materialistic perspective, materialistic ideology. And it's not a surprise, not to say that spirituality, religion ever went out of fashion, but certainly the humanists of the day, rooted in the kind of biological materialism of the day, has in large respect, during the 1900s and leading up to today, had a large measure of influence in shaping of our culture and our society. And it's no coincidence, once again. But something strange seems to be happening. Again, it's not that religion or spirituality has ever gone out of fashion, but there is a sense in which there were seasons where it was a little bit quieter, a little bit more muted. Certainly, aspects of the unseen realm were muted in discussions, and they are and remain in many of the evangelical churches muted. Baptist churches don't talk about these things. Ironically, certain reports are going up about the unseen realm from spiritual encounters, religious experiences, mystical experiences, near-death experiences, deathbed visions are being talked about once again, afresh in a new way, and they're being documented more frequently than they were in recent history. Surprise? Is this surprising? Well, it is interesting. It is strange in terms of cultural development and dialectic. What is taking place now in terms of the uptick of interest in these things? It almost, and I would strongly suggest, and I'm not the only one, that the West has existed and has been existing in a kind of darkness. Thinking of the Platonic allegory of the cave, or even in Dante, I'm reminded of this as I'm giving a talk shortly on Dante. Dante begins his Divine Comedy in darkness in his journey. He begins in darkness. And this isn't just kind of an interesting story that's fictional or metaphorical, but it is something that is, you might say, a realistic but rich metaphor for the West right now, as the West has experienced a great deal of decline, societal decline of the goods and virtues that once stabilized it and made it great. And now there's a decline, but now as we're seeing the rise and the shaping of materialism and naturalism, secularism, humanistic values, we're realizing we're being confronted with the reality of the unseen realm in a way that we have to give some expression to it, some explanation to it. We have to enter into a dialectic about it. There is a real dialectic that needs to take place within the context of the churches themselves, amongst Christians who are seeking to reclaim in a robust way their Christian heritage and their Christian knowledge as it pertains to the unseen realm and deep religious experiences that appear to be occurring and appear to be issues of discussion right now. And it all is pointing to certainly a drive toward mystery, the desire for mystery that has been long, in some ways, lost. And so I want to begin with an observation. Over the last 100 years, we've been told a very specific story. Certainly, this has been a common story with in amongst the humanistic thought. If you go back to the Humanistic Manifesto in the 30s, which was revised in the 70s and then again in the early 2000s, there is a common story that has dominated much of secular thinking, and has it had a place in the kind of cultural consciousness of the people, the societal consciousness of the people of the American West. And that is that science has explained the universe, or has the resources, at least, to explain the the universe. And religion itself, in some ways, in many circles, many prominent circles, many influential circles from many influential leaders in the scientific realm, have pushed religion to the edges or to the margins, you might say. They're marginalized. And in some ways, religion really has been marginalized in Western culture, Western society. And I think this is certainly a problem that needs to be addressed head on and entered into as a dialectic. There's been a story, furthermore, that human beings are merely biological machines, reducible to their cogs and their moves, their turnings, their triggers and pulleys, bloods and guts, as it is interacting in a rich, complicated way nonetheless, but nonetheless reducible to it. Consciousness, then, it simply is what the brain does. It is a product of the functioning of the neural patterns firing in the brain. Eventually, neuroscience will explain the rest of what it is that we have to explain about consciousness. That's the story we've been sold for so long. But something strange is happening over the last decade. Something strange has happened over the last decade that's important, that we need to highlight, that we need to isolate and think about. This phenomena within societal consciousness as it's being confronted quite heavily with experiences and reports that are contradicting that worldview, that materialistic worldview that has been so prominent and has had such a role in shaping our social, as Charles Taylor would say, our social imaginaries, our imagination. It has played on our imagination to such an extent that we cannot see the world as it truly is. We are literally becoming incapable of doing so. We cannot. This new phenomena that has occurred is gaining traction. It's gaining interest, even amongst some of the wealthiest people on earth. They're pouring a great deal of money, millions and billions of dollars, into consciousness research as well as in neuroscientific research at the intersection of questions about what it means to be conscious, what it means to be a person, what it means to be a human being. These are central questions that are at the center of a great deal of research programs presently that are taking place. Certainly in the World Economic Forum, we see this, but in many other places as well, we're seeing this reality. Certainly with the intersection of artificial intelligence itself has reopened questions, important questions about ultimate meaning, philosophical questions that philosophers have debated for centuries. Artificial intelligence is opening up afresh in a unique way, in a way that we need to address. And as Christians, we need to entertain, we need to engage and enter into the dialectic that is already taking place right in front of us. And we need to be the source of information, the source of curated information on those matters and topics, so that we show and demonstrate the hope truly that is within, and the reason that we do have hope for our worldview, for our life, for our living, for the afterlife, at the intersection of these questions about consciousness itself. Universities are seriously studying near-death experiences now. Near-death experiences have seen an uptick. The rise of that, we've seen more near-death experiences. We hear more reports of near-death experiences, and these are also being documented more frequently. There has been a significant uptick of interest in these, but also reports about these and documentations regarding these types of experiences. And these all impinge upon, again, the invisible realm, the unseen realm, the things that we, as many would take to be kind of superstitious realm. Certainly psychedelic research has returned in full force. There is a great deal of interest in psychedelic research. There has been a great deal of uptick of interest in it and experimentation with it in terms of motivating certain religious experiences. This has seen a rise. Certainly in this younger generation, the generation even prior to me, there is a significant interest in it. It's certainly being brought into many of the counseling therapeutic practices that are taking place presently. And this is, I would say, arguably no coincidence. And simultaneously overlapping with that, there's been an uptick of astrology interest. And the interest in occult spirituality is now exploding. It is exploding in a way that we cannot ignore it, and we must make sense of it. We must engage it with our Christian worldview and framework to make sense of it and show the world that we have the resources really and truly to make sense of it and to give an answer for the hope that is within in terms of the cultural climate and the dialectic that is taking place right now. So here's my question. If materialism won, naturalism, secularism won, why is everyone suddenly searching for the soul again? Why is everyone suddenly searching for the soul again? The question tells us something happening beneath the surface of our culture. Something truly is happening beneath the surface of our culture. There has been arguably an unexpected, unprecedented, unplanned for, at least I don't know if there has been a plan by some of the major leaders or oligarchs above us. It's unknown to us, but there has been an unexpected return of consciousness. Here's the question. Here's an important question. Why is consciousness suddenly one of the hottest topics in the world, arguably? Why is it one of the hottest topics in the world? I think it's one of the hottest topics, partly because artificial intelligence itself is on the rise and seeing such unprecedented success in terms of doing a lot of things that conscious individuals did for themselves at a much quicker rate, more efficiently. And we're seeing, again, science produce predictable results, in some ways predictable results, and it's simplifying and making bringing about efficiency to human tasks that in recent history were something that only humans could do themselves. So everybody gets AI in some sense. At least we have some experience of artificial intelligence. Most of us know about it. If you're on the internet at all, you're encountering AI modules all over the place, AI tools that are influencing and shaping our culture presently and shaping our dialectic presently and forcing us to ask these new questions. Artificial intelligence is forcing everyone to ask this question. What makes a human different? What makes a human different? That simple, basic question that historians and philosophers, religious leaders have asked for so long is being asked again in a fresh way. And that question is being raised new in a fresh way that needs to be certainly addressed. Is it language that makes us different? Or the capacity for complex language? Is it reasoning capacity, as has been common throughout much of history? Many have saw the reasoning or the rational capacity of human beings as being the distinctive feature, property, or capacity that makes us different, that sets us apart. Some would say it's more imagination. Certainly, some religious scholars have recently proposed that. Even creativity. Creativity is something that is uniquely us. Or is it emotion? Is it emotion? We certainly have more complex emotions than any other biological organism in the world. What about the nature of memory? Memory is certainly uniquely human insofar as we develop our stories based upon our memory, our memorial recall, and our stories and narratives are rooted in the memorial capacity that we have. But if machines can imitate all of those, then what's left? What's left for us? What's left of explaining? What do we need to explain? What do we have to explain? What resources do we have to make sense of the distinction between humanity and artificial intelligent machines? Then there's a move to medicine. Let's talk about medicine. The recent interest of medicine has certainly become of interest and impactful, and impinges upon wider questions about consciousness, and particularly wider questions about consciousness as uniquely human, what it means to be uniquely human. Certainly, I'm thinking of comas and how it is that humans can actually enter into a state of coma and what actually is going on. There's been some recent research on that done, and what it means for them, at least in their conscious states of awareness, to come out of comas. Certainly, dementia has become a recent fascination of study, and there's been a lot of studies done on dementia patients, and the fact that dementia patients often lose their sense of identity. They might even forget their names. Well, in many cases they do. It's documented, of course. They forget many basic historical markers in their past. Their memorial recall is faltering. It is failing them. And yet there's simultaneous fascinating data on dementia that is suggestive that religious identity persists. It endures even late into dementia. This fascination is an aspect of consciousness. It's certainly an aspect of consciousness that it's been argued that naturalism, physicalism, materialism, secularism cannot seem to explain. It does not provide an adequate explanation of it. And more than that, this translucent sort of clarity of the mind is not only a fascinating area that I think it can explain, but even more so, it seems to go against what we would expect, certainly what we would expect if materialism were true. But this raises also, coupled with this, when you bring this into discussion with near-death experiences, a further line of information and argumentation that cannot be explained by materialism. It just simply does not have the resources to explain near-death experiences. And that has to do with how we understand the human being in relation to brain injury. We would expect these things not to occur. In fact, we would predict that these things would not occur. But in fact, the data, the reports that are being documented and growing tremendously really do go against that hypothesis of what we would expect if materialism is true. And so this raises all sorts of questions, important, significant, practical questions at the intersection of even religion as a more dominant explanation for end-of-life care, for identity. And doctors are certainly asking questions that are reserved for those who are invested in religious studies, theology itself, questions that theology itself has always asked. Then there's philosophy. In philosophy, we see an uptick of interest. This has been going on certainly since the 70s. There has been certainly a reaction to materialism, to the various materialistic views that were put forward and presented in the early 1900s, especially in the West, from logical positivism to logical behaviorism to reductionistic materialism to identity physicalism, all trying to explain that consciousness and the various aspects of consciousness can be explained in a materialistic worldview. But then we see, certainly in the 70s, we start to see these cracks that are opening up about consciousness. We start to see these cracks that are opening up, that philosophers are being confronted with and positing different theories of explanation for consciousness because materialism simply just does not have the resources to explain consciousness. Certainly, this has often been called by David Chalmers famously the hard problem of consciousness. How do we make sense of qualia? In other words, qualitative experience, what it is like to be this way. No mechanistic explanation can explain or capture fully qualitative experience. What about the nature of free will, if there is even such a thing as free will? Intentionality itself, where does that come from in a materialistic framework? How do we explain the taste of chocolate ice cream? and how good it is on a materialistic framework according to mechanisms? How do we explain the significance, meaning, overall purposefulness of experiencing a piece of art? Or if you believe in religious art like statues or icons, how do we explain these as being transcendent, certainly transcending the materials that make them up and that fit into an overarching, meaningful story? How do we make sense of that? How do we even make sense of the perception of color? Philosophers are struggling to answer that. But what seems abundantly clear is that materialistic explanations fail. They simply don't have the resources to explain these things. They simply don't. 20 years ago, almost nobody outside philosophy departments actually cared. So this was not as big of an issue. It was starting to creep in, certainly maybe 20, 30 years ago. But like you had certain dissenters who were sounding, you might say, the clarion call, the alarm bells, ringing the bell. There's something wrong in the departments of philosophy and science that have given way to materialistic, naturalistic, secularistic science. And so now it's even quite on the rise, especially within the last 10 years, even with the fascination, the obsession with variant forms of what is often called panpsychism. The view that consciousness is somehow intrinsically a part of the material universe, and even the material bits underlying the universe comprise it. The physical bits that physics departments explore. But why now? Why is there seemingly to be a sudden explosion? Well, follow the money. It's not conspiracy, but it is certainly a curiosity. It is a question that needs to be asked. It is a question that needs to be kind of sought after, explored, researched, where we notice patterns, where we develop patterned thinkings, money trails. Ask, if you wanted to understand what society values, where would you look? The obvious answer in our society, what the society really values or what it will value in the future because of where the money is spent, is where is the money? Show me the money and you will see the trail, the patterns that are explaining what people, particularly intellectual leaders, really, really care about and why they care about it. And that too will begin to shape what it is that even the common person cares about, how it trickles down into societal conversation. We're seeing all sorts of things that we've been discussing on this channel, and it's the Theological World After All, about Silicon Valley. And certainly if you've listened to several of our discussions about the rise of paganism and neopaganism, this has been around for a while. The IT tech departments that often coincided, certainly in the 70s, with a lot of the New Age movements, are taking serious interest in consciousness studies. The tech experimenters are simultaneously interested, certainly in spirituality and what kind of spirituality they can fabricate or create for themselves or generate by themselves. All of this centers upon this wider question about consciousness itself. Silicon Valley always seems to be at the center of these more, oftentimes in the beginning at least, what seems like fringe discussions. This has certainly been the case in many, as we look at Silicon Valley in California, everything that seems to come out of there in terms of tech explorations and research, oftentimes, at least in the beginning, looks very fringe. Just look at some of our discussions on neopaganism. Look at the various discussions in the political environment coming out of California. Look at the Burning Man conversations that are taking place, or the World Economic Forum. And even just look at the uptick and rise of interest in neopaganism itself, witchery, the occult itself, all intersecting, psychedelic research, all intersecting with this fascination that is on the rise right now with consciousness and consciousness studies. There are consciousness institutes that have just been built up in recent years, series and conferences that have popped up in recent years. Oftentimes, many of it looks, at least from the outset, from a normal kind of perceiver who's not maybe in these circles, not running in these circles, not doing this kind of study, it would look and appear as very fringe, very fringe. There are brain-computer interface programs, platforms, institutes that are fixating on these questions of how it is that we bring about brain and computer interfaces, all interacting with and overlapping with this more fundamental question about consciousness. There are private foundations that are raising money and supporting what otherwise looks like fringe consciousness conferences. There's a growing interest amongst military intel about consciousness and how it is that we can capitalize on it, how it is that we can control it. There's a growing set of interests within medical research that it too overlaps with consciousness studies in important ways. One of the more fascinating and surprising historical footnotes to this discussion right now that I've just started asking the question is Jeffrey Epstein, who funded a number of scientists working in the areas connected to consciousness, cognition, and related questions. He even funded what really did appear to be a fringe conference for more than 1 year at Arizona State University. There was one even last year in the fall that was canceled because it came out. It was going to occur right around the time some of the Epstein files were coming out. That in itself is a fascinating question that deserves some kind of answer. It deserves looking into and asking questions about it. Whether his motives, whatever they are, and they remain, a subject of considerable debate. I think we could come up with some answers, and we will. We'll talk about this. But there's certainly considerable debate. The funding itself is a trail illustrating something, a story, illustrating that there is, once again, certainly elite interest in these kinds of questions that extend beyond mere theology or philosophy itself. I don't want to overstate the evidence. Something to look into. Let the document be put forward. Let the facts speak for themselves, and then we can explore what's going on there and see if we can find other trails. Why? Why spend billions here? Because consciousness, the effects of consciousness, the capacity for consciousness, the manipulation of consciousness. In some sense, if we can control consciousness, these types of things may be the most valuable resources of the next century. And there's a lot going on coming out, again, out of Silicon Valley from the tech leaders of the day, exploring just these areas, experimenting in just these areas, to see what new findings they can find and what they can do with it. It's not oil that might be the most valuable resource, certainly. It's not data. A lot of that is taking place. Data is valuable, and we've collected a lot of data over the years in various ways. Data is being collected on us on the internet, of course. It is, though, human consciousness, the powers of consciousness, the manifestation that follows, the implications that follow from consciousness itself. Here's what's fascinating. These questions themselves are also ancient questions. They're old. We've been here before. So this becomes a historical question as well. Maybe we need to be more familiar with our history of consciousness itself, conscious experience. It's not merely academic. Human beings have always wondered about consciousness and how it is that we know what we know, how it is that we can know what we know, how it is that we're aware of what we know, and how it is that we access what the world is and what we can know about the world. Certainly, knowledge is power. Consciousness is even more fundamental, that serves as a kind of mirror to the universe. It serves as an outlet to the universe. It serves as a sign, you might say, of the meaning, purpose of the universe. And these kinds of basic questions humans have always wondered about. Who am I? I mean, in the scriptures in Psalm 8, we say, who am I that you are mindful of me? What happens after death, and how can we control that? Why am I conscious? A more interesting question that has not been raised even in recent research or academic studies is, what is consciousness actually for? What's the purpose? Why do I even matter as a speck of dust in this massive universe? These kinds of questions certainly have been of importance to the Greeks, the Greek philosophers, to Judaism, certainly as Psalm 8 suggests, to Christianity, to medieval theology. All took these questions seriously, very seriously, and they're coming up once again in a fresh new way, in a new context, in a new way that is actually fascinating and quite scary on the other hand. But even though these were interested, then something changed arguably in the narrative, the historical narrative. Modernity occurred, the Enlightenment occurred. We began to see materialistic explanations of consciousness and persons and souls, certainly with the rise of the scientific method following from Francis Bacon, arguably. No, I'm not saying that Bacon affirmed something like that. I'm not trying to pin too much on him, but how people came along and used him in the history of philosophy actually matters. And sometimes it matters more than what they actually believed. Certainly, the Leviathan becomes an important literature piece in the history of intellectual thought about consciousness. Reductionism became, at least late in modernity, the explanation of consciousness, the answer of the day. Materialism, that it is just material bits in motion. That mechanistic science itself can explain it. None of these in themselves are necessarily bad, but together they encouraged us, they impacted us, they played upon our imaginations in such a way that if we could explain the parts, we had explained the whole. And so that was the deception. And it was a deception in the history of philosophy that took root and began to shape societal thought and consciousness about it. Charles Taylor talks about this when he talks about modern people who have become buffered selves, who have buffered that, and they've, as a result, developed a thin worldview that has kept them and kept other ideas at bay, away. The world in this manner loses depth. It becomes a thin world, an uninteresting world. Certainly, this has been a part of the recent literature amongst many who have departed from the faith, departed from their religious inheritance, departed from their Protestant or evangelical faith. They describe, in some cases, like Megan O'Giblin, the world is uninteresting. The world is really kind of disenchanted, which arguably much of the dialectic has occurred around this phenomena where societal consciousness has been given to materialism itself as the explanation. And yet mystery, the experience of mystery, becomes an anomaly in this case, because it impacts our imagination in negative ways and creates a thin world in which we live. Not a rich world, a thin world, a boring world. Dale Allison, in his recent book, Encountering Mystery, talks about some of this phenomena and how it is that people really never stopped having extraordinary experiences, but they just didn't have the categories to interpret them. They didn't have the conditions right to make them or to recognize them. They didn't have, in other words, as the Gospels would say, as Jesus constantly calls us to, the eyes to see and the ears to hear. They did not have the spiritual perception to see the world as it truly is. And that may, in part, certainly explain why there has been a recent uptick of people increasingly interested in astrology, occultic practices, energy and manifestation practices, and the experiences themselves that persist even when the theological framework has been discarded, or even when the Christian worldview has largely been chipped away at, or been jettisoned, or let go of, or one has simply departed from it. Maybe the problem isn't transcendence has disappeared. Maybe we forgot how to name it because we just lost the categories. We lost the conditions for knowledge of it. We lost the internal life rich enough to sustain it so that we could have eyes to see and ears to hear. And we've lost, in other words, as a result of this, I would argue, Christianity has its forgotten contribution to the world. What if Christianity's greatest gift to civilization wasn't simply morality or politics or hospitals or universities, although in many respects Christianity is responsible for those things historically, as the heritage sets the conditions to make sense of those things and to encourage and motivate people to build these kinds of this kind of institutional strength to be about this business. What if it gave the West its understanding of the human person? And that's the deeper issue. That's the more fundamental issue that matters. In the Christian worldview, we are told from the very early passages of Genesis that human beings are created in the image of God. Human dignity is something that is intrinsic or inherent in some way in humanity, or at least human honor, that all humans are deserving of some kind of honor. Certainly in Genesis 9:6, we see that human beings themselves are free in some sense, and this grounds in some way their moral responsibility in the world. They are morally responsible agents. We see in the Christian worldview an explanation, or at least the sense of love, that's rooted ultimately in the transcendent reality of God himself, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We see ultimate personhood rooted in an ultimately personal universe, an ultimately personal reality. And this grounds, furthermore, the hope of the resurrection that Christians proclaim and have proclaimed throughout church history. All these things assume something about what it means to be human and what human beings are for. And Christianity has supplied that at the intersection of this discussion about consciousness. So, if Christianity is right, the soul isn't just an optional doctrine that we can jettison or get rid of, or excise in our system, or excise in one of the central webs of our overarching web of beliefs, or one of the threads, at least, of our web of beliefs. It's foundational serving underneath these realities that we've just talked about. So that brings us to another question, the question behind every cultural debate that we have. Everything comes together at this point. Everything is made sense of at this point. And it hangs on the threads that comprise the overarching web of beliefs that Christianity truly does supply us with. It makes sense of. It gives us resources to make sense of artificial intelligence, gender, education, abortion, euthanasia, genetic engineering, consciousness generally, transhumanism, politics, justice, mental health, death, even death itself. And what do all these debates have in common? What do they all have in common at the end of the day? They're really all arguments about anthropology. They're arguments about human nature. They're arguments about what it means to be a person. Can we answer those questions with religion or theology? Or as theology itself, as I've suggested many other times elsewhere in other contexts, has theology itself been quietly shaping the conversation all along? In what way has it? To what extent? One of the reasons I wrote Why Souls wasn't simply because I wanted to defend doctrine, although I believe in doctrine. Doctrine matters. And I think a lot of our life will depend upon how it is that we live on the basis of good doctrine. It was because, though, I became really convinced that the church has something our culture desperately needs, that it is lost or forgotten about. It's lost its memory, in other words. In the biblical word anamnesis, it has forgotten because it has forgotten how to remember. The culture doesn't just need more arguments. It needs a vision of what it means to be human, a vision capable of grounding dignity, freedom, hope, love, worship, and even death. So over the next several episodes in the campaign, we're going to explore some of those questions together briefly. And I hope by the end you'll see that the soul isn't a relic of the past to be discarded. It may be the missing piece for understanding our future, as there's much anxiety around this question of the future. Who are we? Today's conversation wasn't really about billionaires, AI, or consciousness research. It was about something even deeper than that. Every culture lives out an answer to the question, what is a human being? Whether we recognize it or not, politics, our technology, our economics, our medicine, even our entertainment flow from that answer. Oh, you got to get it right. That's why this is, in the end, a theological world after all.